The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, not the kind of rain that cleans things, the kind that reminds you how small you are. It came down through the pines in silver sheets drumming against the roof of an old Ford pickup parked at the far end of a gravel lot outside Harlow, Montana. Inside the truck, a man sat with his hands wrapped around a gas station coffee cup that had gone cold 2 hours ago. He wasn't drinking it, he was just holding it. Sometimes that's all a man can do. Hold something warm until it isn't anymore. His name was Cole Baxter. He was 38 years old, though most people who looked at him guessed older. Not because he looked broken, he didn't, not exactly. But there was something in his eyes that men who had seen real darkness carry without knowing it. A stillness that doesn't come from peace. A quiet that comes from having heard too much. In the back seat, a German shepherd named Ranger lay with his head resting on his front paws, watching Cole the way only dogs watch the people they have chosen. Not with pity, with attention. There is a difference, and dogs understand it better than most humans ever will. Cole had served 12 years in the Navy, the last 4 as part of a SEAL unit that operated in places that don't appear on the maps shown to civilians. He had been good at it, genuinely good, the kind of soldier that other soldiers talk about quietly with respect that borders on something else. He had come home the way many of them do, walking, breathing, technically intact. But the man who boarded the plane home was not the same man who had left. The things Cole had seen, the sounds he had heard, the weight of decisions made in seconds that could not be unmade, they had taken up residence somewhere behind his eyes and never left. The doctors had a name for it. The VA had paperwork for it. His former commanding officer had called it an adjustment period. Cole had a simpler name for what it felt like most mornings when he woke up gasping in the dark. He called it the passenger. It rode with him everywhere. To the construction jobs he couldn't keep because a nail gun would split his vision in half and send him back somewhere hot and airless and loud. To the apartments he had rented and lost when the rent slipped past him during the bad weeks. To the relationships that had tried and failed to hold against something they couldn't see or touch or reason with. To here, to this gravel lot, to this cold coffee, to this rain. He had been living in the truck for 8 months. 8 months of gas stations and rest stops and the particular humiliation of washing your face in a truck stop bathroom while men in business casual clothes glance at you in the mirror and look away. 8 months of stretching every dollar until it was nearly transparent. 8 months of Ranger sleeping against his legs at night so that when the passenger arrived, and it always arrived somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, there was something warm and real and present to hold on to. The dog had been part of a military K-9 program, trained to detect explosives, track through dense terrain, hold position, under fire without flinching. He had worked alongside Cole for 3 years overseas before the program ended, and the question of what to do with the working dogs became briefly an uncomfortable bureaucratic problem. Cole had solved the problem the only way that made sense to him. He had taken Ranger home. That decision, it turned out, had been the last truly correct one Cole made before everything started falling apart. And so here they were. A man and his dog in a parking lot in Montana on a Tuesday in November, $3.40 in Cole's wallet, half a bag of dry dog food in the back seat, and the specific kind of quiet that descends on a person when they have run out of next steps. The coffee was cold. The rain kept falling. Ranger watched Cole with those steady amber eyes. Then the tap came at the driver's side window. Cole's hand moved before his mind did, reaching toward the door handle. Body already rotating, the passenger flooding up through his chest with a cold electric surge. Old reflexes, the kind that don't ask permission. But it was just a deputy, young, maybe 25, with a rain-slick jacket and the uncomfortable expression of a man delivering news he didn't write. Cole rolled the window down an inch. "Sir," the deputy cleared his throat, "I'm going to need you to move along. This lot is private property." Cole looked at him, looked at the empty lot around them. The hardware store it belonged to had been closed for 2 hours. "I'll be gone by 6, Cole said, "before they open." The deputy shifted his weight. He looked like he wanted to be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone with a different task on this particular rainy Tuesday. I understand that, sir, but I've had a complaint. I need you to move tonight. A complaint. Cole said it flatly, not angry, just noting the shape of the word. Yes, sir. Cole looked at the empty lot again, the empty road beyond it, the dark tree line at the edge of town where the mountains started their long climb toward a sky he couldn't see. He thought about asking who had complained. He thought about explaining that there was nowhere else to go tonight, not in this rain, not with $3.40. He thought about a lot of things. He rolled the window back up. He started the truck. What Cole did not know, could not have known, sitting in that coal cab with Ranger pressing his warm nose against the back of his neck, was that the complaint had not come from the hardware store owner. It had come from a man named Prescott Morrow, a developer, a man with a surveying crew scheduled for first light the following morning, and a particular distaste for loose ends witnesses and anything that might complicate the quiet business he conducted in quiet corners of this county. Morrow had seen the truck that afternoon. He had made one phone call. The deputy who owed Morrow nothing except the general debt that small-town law enforcement owes to men who fund local campaigns and sit on county boards had shown up within the hour. Cole didn't know any of this. He just drove. Walt Greer had owned the same general store for 31 years. It sat at the intersection of Route 12 and a county road with no real name, just a number that locals never used because they navigated by landmarks in memory the way people in small places always do. The store smelled like pine resin motor oil and the particular combination of coffee and sawdust that Walt had long ago stopped noticing, but that newcomers always remarked on. The floors were original wood worn smooth in the traffic paths between the door and the counter. The bulletin board beside the entrance was pinned so full of notices and cards and flyers that new additions had to overlap old ones, creating a layered archaeology of community business going back years. Walt was 68 years old. He had the hands of a man who had worked with them his whole life and the eyes of a man who had spent those same years paying attention. He had served in Vietnam, not something he talked about, but something that lived in the way he looked at certain men when they came through his door. A recognition, a kind of seeing that most people couldn't manage and didn't know they were missing. Cole came through the door at 7:40 in the morning, Ranger walking close beside him. The bell above the door rang. Walt looked up from the coffee he was making behind the counter. He took in the truck outside the way Cole moved the dog, the quality of the man's clothes, not dirty, but lived in, pressed into service well past their original purpose. He said nothing about any of it. Coffee? Walt asked. Please, Cole said. Walt poured it. Cole paid with coins, which he counted out carefully on the counter. Walt did not watch the counting. He looked at Ranger instead, who was sitting with excellent posture just inside the door, ears forward, nose working the room. K9, Walt said. Cole glanced up. Used to be. Military program. Walt nodded once like something confirmed. He slid the coffee across the counter. Cole drank it standing up. He didn't say much. Walt didn't push. There was a kind of conversation that happens between men of a certain type, men who have stood in dangerous places and come back carrying the weight of it, that doesn't require many words to be complete. Walt recognized what Cole was. Cole recognized that Walt recognized it. That was enough. It was when Cole turned to leave that he saw the bulletin board. He would think about this moment later in the weeks and months that followed when everything had changed and he was trying to understand the shape of how it had happened. He would think about the fact that he had almost not gone into that store, that he had driven past it once nearly out of gas and only turned back because Ranger had put his nose against the window in a particular way that Cole had learned to pay attention to. He would think about the deputy from the night before and the rain and the cold coffee and the chain of small disasters that had to have happened in exactly the sequence they did to bring him to that intersection at that hour in front of that board. The notice was small, index card handwritten in careful block letters pinned near the bottom of the board where the older notices curled at the edges. The ink was slightly faded like it had been up for a while. Abandoned cave house for sale. $20. Must take as is. No utilities. Directions available inside. Cole read it twice. He turned back to the counter. Walt was already looking at him. How long has that been up? Cole asked. Walt thought about it. Few months. Nobody's taken it. Too far out. Too much work. He paused. Some people called about it and changed their minds when they heard the condition. What's the condition? Rough, Walt said. Old cabin built into the mouth of a natural cave up past the North Fork. Property goes back into the rock about 60 feet. Nobody's lived there since before I can remember. Roof holds mostly. No power, no running water, but there's a spring about 40 yards east of the structure. Lake's close. He looked at Cole steadily. Closest town is here, about 11 miles. Cole thought about 11 miles. He thought about $3.40. He thought about last night and the night before, and the 8 months of nights before that. $20, Cole said. $20, Walt confirmed. Cole reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded bill. The last one. He had been saving it without quite admitting to himself that he was saving it, carrying it like a man carries a single match in a waterproof case, not planning to use it, but not willing to not have it. He put it on the counter. Walt wrote the directions on the back of a receipt. He slid it across with the bill. Road ends about a quarter mile from the property. You'll need to walk in. Cole picked up the paper. He started toward the door. Son in, Walt said. Cole stopped. He hadn't been called that in a long time. He turned. Walt was looking at him with that particular quality of attention the veterans will look, the one that sees past the surface. Place has been sitting empty a long time, but it's sound, and the land around it is good land. He paused, seeming to choose something. I think it's been waiting for the right person. Cole held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, pushed through the door, and walked back out into the morning. In the truck, Ranger was sitting up straight in the passenger seat, ears forward, watching Cole cross the parking lot with the expression he always wore when something was about to begin. The road north from Route 12 started as pavement became gravel, became dirt, and then became a suggestion. Cole drove it slowly, the truck rocking through ruts that had been frozen and thawed, and frozen again until they had achieved a kind of permanent violence. Pines pressed close on both sides. The sky was gray and low, and the morning light came through it thin and directionless, the kind of light that doesn't cast shadows. The road ended at a low bank above a frozen stream bed. Cole killed the engine. He sat for a moment listening to the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant sound of wind moving through the tops of the trees. Then he got out. Ranger dropped down beside him without being told, landing silently in the snow and immediately lifting his nose to read whatever the air was saying. They walked in. The path through the trees was faint, but present, the compressed ghost of something that had once been used regularly and hadn't been forgotten entirely by the land. It curved around a granite outcrop, and then the trees thinned and Cole stopped walking. The lake was smaller than he had imagined. Perfectly still, its surface gray-white under the clouded sky, rimmed with ice at the edges, but open in the center where a slow current moved beneath. Pine trees came down to the water on three sides. On the fourth, the rocky hillside rose maybe 40 feet before leveling into a shelf of land covered in snow. And there, set into the base of that hillside, was the cave house. It was smaller than he'd pictured it and larger than he'd feared. A cabin face wood, weathered silver gray, built directly into the mouth of a natural cave. Two windows, both intact, though so layered with grime that they let in no light. A door hung slightly open on its hinges, not broke, just settled. The roof sagged in one quadrant, but held everywhere else. Moss grew along the junction where the wood met the rock. Icicles hung from the eave in a long, even row. The whole structure looked like it had grown out of the hillside rather than been built onto it, like it belonged to the rock the way trees belong to soil. Cole stood there for a long moment. Ranger moved past him, trotting toward the door without hesitation, nose working hard. He pushed through the gap, disappeared inside. Cole followed. The inside was dark and cold and smelled of old wood, mineral damp, and time. A single room with a stone fireplace that dominated the right wall, a plank shelf that had served as a kitchen surface, two boarded window frames, a wooden floor that was warped but solid, and beyond the back wall of the cabin, visible through an arched opening, cut directly into the rock, the cave itself. The cave ran back into darkness, maybe 50 feet, maybe more. The temperature inside it was different. Not warmer exactly, but more constant, stable, the kind of cold that doesn't move. Ranger was already in there. Somewhere in the dark, Cole could hear him moving his paws quiet on the stone floor, his nose working steadily. The sound of a dog doing what he was built to do. Cole stood in the cabin and looked around. He took in the fireplace, calculating whether it still drew. He looked at the floor and the walls and the ceiling. He looked at the cave opening and the darkness beyond it. Then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He let out a slow breath and let his shoulders drop. It wasn't hope. He wasn't ready for hope. But it was something in the same family. A loosening. The particular sensation of a man who has been braced for a long time and has just for a moment stopped. He turned back to find Ranger standing in the entrance to the cave section. The dog was looking at him with those amber eyes, ears forward, body still. And then Ranger turned and walked back into the dark and stopped and looked back over his shoulder at Cole. "Come and see," the posture said. "Come and see what I've found." "Not tonight, buddy," Cole said quietly. His voice sounded strange in the enclosed space, real, solid, like something landing. "Not tonight." He went back out to the truck for the sleeping bag and the food and the few things he carried that mattered. He built a fire in the stone fireplace from wood stacked under the eave outside, old dry good wood, stacked with care by someone who had known what they were doing. The fire caught on the third match. By dark, the cabin was warmer than the truck had been in months. The first night brought the passenger. It always came between 2 and 4, finding the gap between sleep cycles, the way water finds the crack in a foundation. Cole had learned not to fight the arrival of it. Fighting made it worse, pushed it into shapes that were harder to bear. He had learned instead to let it move through him the way weather moves, loud and cold and disorienting, and then gone, leaving damage that could be assessed and managed. It came out of the sound of the wind. A branch somewhere in the forest above the cave shifted and cracked a sharp, clean sound, the kind of sound that is identical in the architecture of the nervous system to other sounds that belong to other places. Cole was asleep, and then he was not. The cabin was gone, and the fire was gone, and the cold Montana night was gone, replaced by something hot and airless and loud, replaced by dust, and a sky the color of old brass, replaced by the specific geometry of a moment he had tried for years to leave behind, and that had for years declined to be left. He didn't call out. He had trained himself not to call out. But his hands were gripping the sleeping bag, and his breathing had gone shallow, and his heart was doing the thing. It did, the combat rhythm, fast and flat, designed for sustained action, terrible for lying still in a dark cabin in Montana. Then Ranger was there. He didn't jump. He didn't bark. He simply moved across the floor and pressed his full body weight against Cole's chest. 90 pounds of warm muscle in steady breathing, smelling of pine needles and in the particular scent of animal certainty that Cole had come to understand as Ranger's version of "I am here. I am here. You are here. We are here." The weight broke through. Cole's hands moved from the sleeping bag to Ranger's coat. He pressed his fingers into the fur the way a drowning man presses his hands into solid ground, and he breathed. Once. Twice. The hot, airless place receded. The brass-colored sky faded. The cabin returned around him, plank by plank, in shadow by shadow, until he was fully inside it again. Fully in Montana, fully in this cold and real and present moment. 8 breaths. That was how long it took. He lay there afterward with his hands still buried in Ranger's coat, looking up at the ceiling of the cabin, at the shadows that the dying fire threw across the planks. The dog didn't move. He kept his weight against Cole's chest steady and deliberate like a man holding a rope. Okay, Cole said finally. To himself or to the dog or to the passenger, he wasn't sure which. Okay. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The fire settled to coals. The lake was silent. Ranger lifted his head once to look at the arched opening into the cave. His ears came forward. He looked at it for a long moment with an attention that was not curiosity and not alarm, but something more purposeful than either. Then he looked back at Cole, then back at the cave. Cole watched him. Tomorrow, Cole said. Ranger put his head back down against Cole's chest and closed his eyes. But his ears, Cole noticed, stayed forward, pointed toward the dark at the back of the cave as if listening to something that hadn't made a sound yet. The morning came clear. The storm had blown itself out overnight and left the kind of day that Montana makes when it decides to show what it's capable of: sky-hard deep blue, every pine bough holding its particular weight of snow, the lake surface broken open and glittering where the wind moved across it. Cole stood in the doorway of the cabin and drank the coffee he'd made on the small camp stove he carried in the truck and looked at it and let it do what it did. For the first time in 8 months, he did not immediately calculate how much further he could stretch the food and the gas. He didn't run the numbers. He just looked at the lake and drank the coffee. Ranger was already outside, moving along the tree line with his nose down, logging the territory, the way K9 dogs log everything methodically, completely, with the kind of total commitment to understanding that humans practice in theory and dogs practice in fact. Cole was watching him when he heard the engine. It came from the direction of the trail through the trees, a vehicle, a good one, quiet, heavy, the sound of something expensive moving over a difficult ground with ease. Cole set his coffee cup on the window ledge and straightened up. The man who came through the trees on foot was wearing a coat that probably cost more than Cole's truck. He was somewhere in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of groomed, settled look that belongs to men who have never had to wonder where the next thing was coming from. His boots were clean despite the trail. His teeth, when he smiled, were even. He walked toward Cole with his hand already extended. "Morning," the man said. His voice was warm, practiced. "Prescott Morrow. I own some acreage up the East Fork." The hand was still extended. Cole looked at it for a moment, then shook it once. "Cole Baxter." Morrow's eyes moved over Cole quickly, assessing, categorizing with the efficiency of a man who does it constantly and has learned to make it invisible. They moved to the cabin. They moved to the truck at the end of the trail. They moved to Ranger, who had stopped at the tree line and was standing completely still, watching Morrow with his ears flat and his nose working. Morrow smiled. "Just came to say hello. Welcome a new neighbor." He looked back at the cabin. Brave choice, this place. Not many people would take it on. "I'm not sure I'd call it brave," Cole said. Morrow laughed like that was charming. "Well, place like this has a lot of potential, lot of character. A beat. I actually had my eye on this property myself a few months back." He said it casually, like a man mentioning something he had almost ordered at a restaurant but decided against. "Never got around to making the move. Life gets busy." Another smile. "I'd be happy to take it off your hands if it turns out to be too much. Give you $500 for it, make it worth your while to move on." Cole looked at him. $500, 25 times what he'd paid 12 hours ago, to a man who had $3.40 yesterday. And Morrow knew that, or had guessed it from the truck, from the clothes, from all the visible arithmetic of Cole's situation. "I just got here," Cole said. Of course, of course." Morrow nodded easy, unbothered. "Offer stands, just keep it in mind." He glanced at Ranger, who had not moved from the tree line and whose gaze had not left Morrow since the man appeared. "Beautiful dog." "He is," Cole said. Morrow held Cole's gaze for one beat longer than was comfortable. Then he smiled again, the same smile, exactly the same, like a card he played when he needed a specific effect, and turned and walked back through the trees. Cole listened to the engine start and move away. He looked at Ranger. The dog was still at the tree line, still completely still, watching the direction Morrow had gone. The growl came low and sustained, not a bark, not a warning, more like information. Like a report delivered in a language that didn't require translation. Cole thought about Walt's voice that morning, the particular care with which he had written those directions on the back of a receipt. The way he had said as if choosing the words, "I think it's been waiting for the right person." He thought about the difference between $500 and $20. He thought about a man who owns acreage on the East Fork and shows up before the snow has even settled from the previous night and already knows the price he wants to pay. Ranger finally looked away from the trees. He turned and looked at Cole, and then he turned and walked to the cabin door and looked back. "Yeah," Cole said quietly. "I know." He wasn't sure what he knew yet, but he knew it was something. He picked up his coffee cup. He went back inside, and at the back of the cabin, beyond the arched opening in the rock wall, the dark of the cave waited with the particular patience of something that has been waiting for a very long time and has learned not to mind. The fourth night was the one that changed everything. The first 3 nights, Cole had slept better than he had in months. Not well, he wasn't sure he remembered what well felt like anymore, but better. The cave held a particular silence that the truck had never offered, a quality of stillness that went beyond the absence of sound into something older and more settled, the quiet of stone and deep earth that had been undisturbed for long enough that it had forgotten how to be anything else. Cole's body, which had been coiled for 8 months against the specific vulnerabilities of sleeping in a vehicle, began very slowly, very cautiously to unknot itself. Ranger helped. Each night, the dog settled against Cole's left side with the precision of something installed there for that purpose. Warm and heavy and steady, breathing in the rhythm that Cole had come to think of as Ranger's deliberate rhythm, not the fast, shallow breathing of a dog chasing dreams, but the slow, measured breath of a tiger that was awake and on watch, and choosing for Cole's benefit to project calm. Those 3 nights, the passenger came but did not stay long. The fourth night was different. Cole woke at 2:15 to the sound of nothing unusual at all, and that was the thing that made every nerve in his body fire simultaneously. He had learned over years of operating in places where danger announced itself through the language of absence and wrongness. Rather than noise, that sometimes the most alarming thing you can hear is precisely nothing. No wind, no settling wood, no distant movement in the trees, just Ranger, barking. Not the low, sustained information growl he had aimed at Morrow's retreating back. This was different, sharp, rhythmic, purposeful, the bark of a dog that has found something and needs a human to come and see it right now. Cole was on his feet before he was fully awake, his hand going to where a weapon would have been in another life, and finding only air. He grabbed the flashlight. Ranger was in the cave, standing in the far back corner, the same corner he had returned to every single night since they arrived, the one Cole had told him twice to leave alone. The dog's posture was different now. Not cautious, not exploratory, committed. He was standing with his front paws already on the ground in that corner, and when the flashlight beam hit him, he didn't look up. He looked at the floor. Cole walked into the cave. The stone floor gave way to packed earth in the back section, a geological seam where the cave's natural floor had been filled in at some point a long time ago deliberately. Cole had noticed it on the first day and thought nothing of it. Old caves got filled in for all kinds of reasons. Animals, water management, structural support. He crouched beside Ranger and pointed the flashlight at the ground. The earth here was different from the earth around it in a way that was almost invisible unless you were looking specifically for it. Slightly darker, compacted differently. Not the random compression of natural settling, but the uniform density of something that had been packed by hand, tamped down deliberately smooth to match the surrounding floor. Someone had dug here once and filled it back in and tried very hard to make sure nobody noticed. Cole looked at Ranger. Ranger looked at Cole. "Okay," Cole said, "okay." He went and got the short-handled camp shovel from the truck. The digging took 40 minutes. The soil was cold and compact, resistant to the blade in a way that told Cole he was working against something that had been settling and consolidating for a very long time. Decades, maybe. His shoulders burned. His breath came in white clouds in the flashlight beam. Ranger sat 2 feet back and watched with the focused, unblinking attention of a dog that has done its job and is now waiting for the human to catch up. At about 18 inches down, the shovel struck something solid. The sound it made, a dull, dense, metallic resonance, hit Cole in the chest in a way he didn't expect. Not loud, almost quiet actually, but with a quality of reality that made the back of his neck prickle. He set the shovel aside and used his hands. The dirt came away in clumps and then in brushed layers, and then the thing was visible. A metal box. Not large, maybe 16 inches long, 10 wide, 8 deep. Heavy steel construction corners reinforced with additional plating. The surface was rusted along every seam and edge, spotted with the deep reddish-brown patterning that meant years underground in damp soil, but the structure itself was intact. The lid seated firmly, a heavy latch on the front corroded, but not collapsed. Cole got his fingers under the edges and pulled. The box came out of the ground with a sucking sound heavy enough that he had to shift his stance to manage it. He carried it to the cabin and set it on the floor near the fireplace. He built the fire up. He cleaned the surface of the box with a cloth, working the dirt out of the seams, and the lettering there was lettering he realized stamped into the steel on the lid surface, barely visible under the rust patina. He cleaned until he could read it. Cole sat back on his heels and looked at it. Ranger sat beside him and looked at it too. The latch required steady pressure applied at a specific angle. Cole found it after a few minutes of careful working, the mechanism grinding against its own corrosion before releasing with a sound like something exhaling for the first time in a very long time. The lid lifted. Inside, packed carefully in layers separated by oilcloth that had survived remarkably well, were things that Cole processed one at a time slowly because his brain needed time to confirm that what his eyes were seeing was real. A cloth bag, small and heavy. He opened it. Gold coins, old ones, American, their faces worn smooth, but their weight unmistakable. Another bag, silver coins, several rings, what looked like a brooch of considerable age and craft. Another bag, loose gemstones, small but real, catching the firelight in red and white and deep blue. He set those aside. Beneath them, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, were documents, papers, folded carefully, edges protected. Cole unfolded them with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable, which he understood instinctively they were. The paper was old but not destroyed. The oilcloth had done its work. He held them close to the firelight and read, land surveys, property records, a mineral rights assessment dated 1961, signed by an independent geological engineer from Billings, describing in technical language the presence of significant copper and silver deposits beneath a property in Cascade County, Montana, a property whose legal description matched precisely the land Cole was sitting on. And beneath that, a deed of ownership. The Alderton family, a husband and wife and their children, owners of record since 1947. Cole read it twice. Then he found the last document in the stack. It was a transfer of ownership, a legal instrument recording the conveyance of the Alderton property to a holding company, dated September 14th, 1962. Signed by both Alderton parents in handwriting that looked nothing like the confident hand in the earlier documents, cramped uneven, the signature of people writing under duress, or fear, or both. And countersigned in a firm, assured hand by a notary whose stamp was clear and readable. And beside the notary stamp, as the witnessing party to the transaction, R. Harlan Morrow. Cole read that name 3 times. Prescott Morrow. The man with the clean boots and the even smile who had appeared out of the trees with a $500 offer before Cole's fire had burned down once. The man whose engine Cole had listened to drive away with a feeling he couldn't name but hadn't dismissed. R. Harlan Morrow. Cole sat with that for a long time. The fire crackled. Ranger had moved to sit directly beside him, his shoulder pressing against Cole's thigh in that steady, deliberate way he had when he understood that a human needed ballast. The mineral rights assessment. The family who had owned this land and then disappeared from it. The holding company that had absorbed the deed in 1962. The son of the man who had witnessed that transfer showing up 60 years later to buy the property from a homeless veteran for $500 before the dirt had settled from the previous night's wind. Cole didn't have all the pieces yet, but he had enough of them to understand the shape of what he was looking at. He wrapped everything carefully back in the oilcloth. He put it back in the box. He set the box against the wall and sat looking at the fire. "Okay, Ranger," he said quietly. The dog's ear twitched toward his voice. "What did you find us?" He drove to Walt's store the next morning. Walt listened without interrupting. He stood behind his counter with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes on Cole's face, and he listened to the whole thing, the box, the coins, the documents, the name on the witness line. When Cole finished, Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and brought up a coffee mug and filled it from the pot behind him and set it in front of Cole without being asked. "Lenora Vance," Walt said. "Who is that retired attorney? Practiced land law in this state for 30 years before she quit." Walt looked at Cole steadily. "She lives in Garnell, about 12 miles east. She's 66, she's sharp as anything, and she doesn't like Prescott Morrow." A pause. "Nobody who knows what they're looking at does." Cole wrapped his hands around the mug. "You know something about this family?" "The Aldertons." Walt's expression shifted in a way that was subtle and carried weight. "My father knew George Alderton," he said carefully, "before my time. He talked about him occasionally. Said the family left sudden in the fall of '62. Said George was a good man who got pressed hard by people with more reach than he had." Walt looked at the window. Said he always felt there was something wrong about how it happened, but there was nothing to be done about it at the time. Cole held that. "Take the box to Lenora," Walt said. "Today if you can, don't sit on this." Lenora Vance's office was 3 rooms in a converted Victorian on Garnell's main street, and it smelled of old paper and strong tea and a lifetime of serious work. She was a small woman with white hair cut practically short and eyes that moved with the quick filing cabinet efficiency of a person who processes information faster than most people generate it. She was 66 and looked it in the way that certain women look their age, not diminished by it, but clarified. She opened the oilcloth without being asked and began reading before Cole had finished explaining where he'd found it. She read for a long time. She set documents aside in a specific order. She went back and reread 2 of them. She held the transfer instrument up to the window light and examined the notary stamp with her reading glasses pushed to the end of her nose. Then she set it down. "This is real," she said, not surprised, more like something confirmed. "What does it mean?" Lenora looked at him over her glasses. "It means the Alderton family owned property containing a documented mineral deposit worth by 1961, estimates somewhere between $3 and $6 million. It means they transferred that property in September of 1962 to a holding company that subsequently became the foundation of the Morrow land holdings in this county." She paused. "And it means the signature on that transfer does not match the Alderton signatures on any other document in this set, which suggests strongly that what took place in September of 1962 was not a willing sale." Cole was quiet. "Prescott Morrow's father," he said. "R. Harlan Morrow, yes." Lenora set down her glasses. "Prescott has been trying to acquire this specific parcel for 2 years. He's gone through 3 different front companies to make inquiries. The previous owner, the estate that ultimately held the cave house land, turned him down every time." She looked at Cole with those quick, filing cabinet eyes. "And then the estate sold it for $20 to pay back taxes, and you bought it." The room was very quiet. "He knows what's underneath," Cole said. "He's always known," Lenora said. His father knew. It's been in that family's awareness for 60 years, the one piece of the original transaction that could unwind everything if it ever came to light. She leaned forward slightly. Those documents are that piece. They established that the transfer was fraudulent. They established that the Aldertons did not leave willingly. And they established that the mineral rights, which were never properly conveyed, because the original transaction was legally void, belonged to whoever holds legitimate title to the land. Which is me, Cole said. Which is you, Lenore said. The attack on the cabin happened 2 nights later. Cole was at the fireplace when Ranger's head came up, not the Morrow growl, not the cave corner whine, but something new and sharp and high in the registers of alarm. Cole was moving before the first sound reached him from outside. Glass, the left window. He got to it in 3 steps and saw through the broken pane a figure at the tree line disappearing into the dark. And beyond the figure, the power line that ran from the small generator Cole had set up 2 days ago cut. Hanging, the generator dark. He checked the perimeter. Ranger worked the ground outside the cabin with his nose tracking, stopping at 3 separate points and marking them with the focused, certain attention that of while you're reading a text clearly written. Boot prints, multiple sets, not random, deliberate, the movement of people who knew where they were going and had a purpose for being there. Cole stood in the dark outside his cabin and looked at the cut power line and the broken window and the boot prints in the snow and felt something settle in his chest that was not anger and not fear. It was the particular cold clarity that had made him good at a job that required a man to be completely present in a dangerous situation without being overwhelmed by it. He went back inside. He took photographs of everything with the disposable camera he'd bought at Walt's store. He wrote down what he'd seen when in a small notebook. He noted the boot print patterns, one set considerably larger than the others, wide-toed work boot specific tread. He had seen that tread before, the first morning, on the trail through the trees coming from the direction where Prescott Morrow had emerged from the pines, with his even smile and his $500 offer. In the morning, he drove to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dodd was 55, gray-haired, deliberate in his movements, in the way of a man who has learned to project steadiness as a professional tool. He listened to Cole with the particular expression that Cole had come to recognize in the 8 months of his homelessness, the expression that takes in the truck, the worn jacket, the quality of the shoes, and arrives at a category before the sentence is finished. He looked at the photographs. He looked at Cole's notes. He said he'd look into it. Cole could hear underneath that what wasn't being said. The legal papers arrived 4 days later. A process server drove out the county road in a sedan, clearly not built for it, and hiked in from where the trail ended and handed Cole an envelope with the careful neutrality of a person paid to deliver bad news to strangers. Cole signed for it. He read it standing in the cabin doorway. Prescott Morrow, through his attorneys, was filing a claim of historical title dispute. The argument, rendered in legal language that Cole read twice to make sure he was understanding it correctly, was that the 1962 transfer, the same transfer, whose documents were currently sitting in Lenora Vance's office in Garnell, constituted the foundational ownership chain for the Morrow land holdings, which included the Cave House parcel as an undivided portion. Morrow was claiming Cole's purchase was invalid because the property had never been properly separated from the larger holding. Additionally, and this was the part Cole read a third time, Morrow's attorneys were filing a supplemental motion questioning Cole's legal standing as a property owner, citing his lack of a verifiable permanent address prior to the purchase. A man without a home could not, under certain readings of Montana property law, establish the residential standing necessary to own one. Cole sat down on the floor. Ranger came and sat beside him. The dog pressed his shoulder against Cole's and looked at the papers in Cole's hands with the expression he wore when he understood that something was wrong and was waiting to find out what he could do about it. Cole looked at the papers. He looked at the cabin around him. He looked at the cave opening beyond the back wall. He thought about 8 months in a truck. He thought about the deputy in the rain and the gravel lot and the cold coffee. He thought about Walt's hand pushing the directions across the counter. He thought about $20. He thought about a name stamped in steel. He thought about a family that had owned this land and built something on it and been pushed off of it by a man with more reach than they had. He thought about what his father had told Walt's father had said George was a good man who got pressed hard by people with more reach than he had. Cole understood being pressed. He had been pressed for years by something that lived inside his own skull, something that had no face and no attorney and no legal strategy, but that had managed to take quite a lot from him anyway. He was still here. He looked at Ranger. 10 days, Cole said, because that was what the papers said, 10 days to file a response or forfeit standing. Ranger looked at him steadily. Then the dog got up and walked to the cave opening. He stopped at the arch and turned and looked at Cole with his ears forward and his body carrying that particular quality of purposeful intention that Cole had learned over 3 years in the field together to read as clearly as language. There is something else. Cole stood up. He took the flashlight from the shelf where he'd left it. He walked to the cave opening and stood beside Ranger and pointed the beam into the dark. "Show me," he said. Ranger turned and walked into the cave, moving not toward the corner where they had found the first box, but deeper past it to the far wall, where a flat-faced granite outcrop rose from the cave floor and leaned against the stone of the hillside in a way that created a narrow shadow behind it. Cole had noted the outcrop on his first inspection of the cave and dismissed it as geology. Ranger stopped behind the outcrop. He sat down. He looked at the base of the cave wall. He looked at Cole. The stone at the base of the wall was different here. Cole crouched and ran his hand along it and found what the flashlight hadn't shown him: a seam. Not in the rock itself, but between the rock and a section of fitted stone that had been placed against it with enough care and enough time to settle that it was almost indistinguishable. Almost. Cole looked at the fitted stone. He looked at Ranger. He pressed both palms against the fitted section and pushed. It shifted. Not easily, not far. Decades of settling had compressed it tight, but it shifted. Cole adjusted his position, got his shoulder into it, and pushed steadily, the way he had learned to push against things that resisted, not with a burst of force, but with sustained patient pressure applied at the correct angle. The fitted stone moved inward 2 inches, then 4, then enough. Behind it was a space, not large, the depth of a man's arm, roughly 2 feet wide, carved into the cave wall with deliberate tool marks still visible in the stone. And inside the space, wrapped in canvas that had survived better than the oilcloth from the first box because the fitted stone had sealed it from moisture almost completely, was a second container, smaller than the first. A wooden box banded in brass that had gone green but held. Cole lifted it out carefully. It was lighter than he expected and heavier than the weight of wood alone, the contents shifting slightly soft, not metallic. He carried it to the cabin. He set it near the fire. He opened the brass catches. Inside was a journal. Leather-bound, handmade from the look of it, the pages thick and cream-colored and filled from edge to edge in a careful, precise hand. Cole lifted it out. The writing was dense, organized, each entry dated. He found the first page. "This is the record of George Alderton, written for whoever finds it, because I have come to believe that what has been done to my family in this county will not remain hidden forever. And when the time comes for the truth to have a witness, I want that witness to have everything they need." Cole read it slowly. The fire burned. Ranger slept pressed against his leg. George Alderton had known what was coming for almost a year before it arrived. He had watched Harlan Morrow acquire neighboring properties one by one, had watched the legal pressure build, had understood with the clear-eyed comprehension of a man who has been paying close attention that his land sitting on top of a copper deposit that an independent engineer had quietly confirmed to him in 1961 was the piece that Morrow needed to complete something larger. He had hired an attorney in Billings. The attorney had been bought. He had gone to the county recorder. The county recorder had been, in the language of 1962, persuaded. He had written to the state capitol. The letters had not been answered. And so George Alderton had done the only thing left to him. He had buried the evidence, not randomly, deliberately carefully with the methodical intelligence of a man who understood that the truth does not stop being true because it is hidden. It just waits. He had packed the documents in oilcloth and buried them under the cave floor. He had placed the journal in a sealed cavity in the wall. He had wrapped everything against time with the knowledge that he might not live to see the outcome of what he had documented, but that someone eventually would. The last entry was dated September 10th, 1962, 4 days before the transfer papers were signed. We leave Tuesday. Margaret is frightened and trying not to show it for the children's sake. I have told her we will find somewhere and we will start again. And that is true, we will and we must. But I cannot stop thinking about the cave and what I left there and whether anyone will ever go looking. I am not a man who believes in fate, but I believe in bogs. I believe that a dog with good training and an honest man at the end of its lead will find what needs to be found. So I am leaving this for that man, whoever he is, whenever he arrives. If you are reading this, the truth is yours now. Don't bury it again. Cole set the journal down. The fire had burned low. Outside, the Montana dark pressed against the small windows. Ranger was awake, watching Cole with those amber eyes that held as always nothing but steadiness and certainty and the patient absolute loyalty of a dog that has chosen its person and does not reconsider. Cole thought about 10 days. He thought about Lenora Vance and the documents already in her hands, and this journal now in his, and a geological survey that was 60 years old but no less true for the passage of time. He thought about a man named George Alderton sitting in this same cave in the fall of 1962, writing by lantern and light about his frightened wife and his mineral rights and his belief that an honest man and a good dog would eventually come. Cole Baxter was not a man given to moments of sentiment. The military had trained that tendency out of him, and the years since had completed the work. But sitting on the floor of that cabin in the Montana dark with his hand resting on a 60-year-old journal, written by a man who had trusted in the eventual arrival of exactly this moment, he felt something move through him that he didn't have a precise name for. Not hope exactly, something older than hope, something that had been in this cave long before he arrived, and that had been waiting with the same patience George Alderton had asked of it for someone to come and pick it up and carry it forward. He looked at Ranger. "We've got 10 days, Cole said quietly, "and now we've got everything we need." Ranger stood. He stretched the long, full-body extension of a dog coming out of stillness into readiness. He shook himself once. He looked at Cole with the expression that Cole had come to recognize as the dog's version of agreement. Then he walked to the door and sat down facing it. Ready. The drive to Garnell took 22 minutes. Cole knew because he counted them. Not deliberately, it was something his brain did in high-stakes situations, the involuntary internal clock that had kept him alive in places where the difference between 22 minutes and 23 could mean something irreversible. He drove with the journal on the passenger seat and Ranger behind him, and the particular quality of focus that descended on him when a situation had moved past the point of weighing options and into the territory of execution. Lenora Vance opened her door before he knocked. She had seen the truck from her window. She stood aside to let him in without a word. Read the room the way people read rooms when they have spent decades in adversarial legal proceedings and have learned to assess the weight of what a person is carrying before they set it down. Cole set the journal on her desk. She read it standing up. She turned pages with 2 fingers carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to history. She read for 20 minutes without speaking. Cole sat in the chair across from her desk and looked at the framed survey maps on her wall and let her read. When she finished, she closed the journal and looked at him. "This changes the character of the case entirely," she said. "How so?" "The documents from the first box established that the transfer was suspicious. They are suggestive." She touched the journal's cover. "This establishes intent. George Alderton understood what was happening to him, documented it in real time, named the party responsible, described the specific mechanism of the fraud, and created a contemporaneous record that no opposing attorney can credibly dismiss as fabricated." She looked at Cole steadily. This is not just a property dispute anymore. This is a 60-year-old fraud case with a living beneficiary, Prescott Morrow, who inherited both the land and apparently the knowledge of what his father did to obtain it. She sat down. His filing of the title dispute last week may turn out to be the worst legal decision he has ever made. It drew a court's attention to a chain of ownership that cannot survive scrutiny. Cole looked at the journal on her desk. He thought about George Alderton writing those final entries by lantern light. About a man who had done everything right and lost anyway, and had spent his last days in that valley doing the only thing left to him, building a time capsule out of truth and patience, in the belief that honesty, given enough time, finds its way to the surface. "What do we do?" Cole asked. Lenora looked at him with those quick, assessing eyes. "We file a response to Morrow's motion. We attach copies of every document from both boxes. We request an emergency hearing on grounds of fraud and historical title interference." She paused. "And we make sure Sheriff Dodd sees the journal before the hearing because there are sections in here that describe specific actions taken against the Alderton family that fall under statutes that don't expire." Cole nodded. "One more thing," Lenora said. She had a particular tone when she was about to say something that required care. Cole had come to recognize it in the 2 meetings they'd had. "Morrow will escalate when he sees this filing. He has resources and he has connections in this county that go back generations. Between now and the hearing, you need to be careful." "I know how to be careful," Cole said. Lenora looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly, "I imagine you do." The hearing was scheduled for 11 days out. In the interval, Cole worked. He repaired the broken window with lumber from a stack behind the cabin that turned out on inspection to be better quality than anything at the hardware store in Harlow. He reinforced the door frame. He set up a simple alarm system along the trail. Nothing sophisticated, just tripwire and tin cans, the field expedient version, that required nothing except attention and noise. He photographed the boot print evidence again after fresh snow covered, and then partially revealed it. He wrote everything down in the notebook with dates and times and precise descriptions. Ranger worked with him, not helping in any mechanical sense, but present, moving through the perimeter checks with Cole in the morning, sitting alert at the cabin entrance, while Cole worked logging the tree line with his nose at intervals throughout the day, in the methodical way that never changed and never became less thorough, regardless of how many times he'd done it. The dog approached the security of their position the way he had approached everything since the military, completely without shortcuts, with the kind of professional consistency that Cole had always found more steadying than any human reassurance. Walt drove out twice. The first time he brought groceries not offered as charity, offered as trade for 2 days of help, stacking new supply inventory at the store, a transaction they both understood for what it was, and neither acknowledged as anything other than commerce. The second time, he brought a thermos of coffee and sat on the step outside the cabin and looked at the lake while Cole worked on the window frame, and they talked in the way Cole had come to appreciate about Walt, intermittently, without pressure, in the comfortable rhythm of men who don't need to fill silence to justify each other's company. "Dodd went out to Morrow's office," Walt said at one point, not looking away from the lake. "Yesterday afternoon." Cole set down his tools. "You know what about—" "No, but Hank Dodd doesn't make social calls." Walt drank his coffee. "He's not a bad man, Cole. He's a man who's operated in a county where certain forces have been in place for a long time and has learned to work around them rather than against them. There's a difference between complicit and careful." Cole thought about that, about the deputy in the rain and the gravel lot, about the report that hadn't been filed. "Sometimes careful looks identical to complicit," Cole said. "Yes," Walt said. "It does." They left it there. The night before the hearing, Cole didn't sleep. Not because of the passenger. The passenger had been quieter since the journal, as if something in the act of finding and holding George Alderton's words had settled a frequency in Cole's nervous system that had been running wrong for a long time. He didn't sleep because he was thinking running through the sequence of the next day, the way he had run through mission sequences in another life, entry points, contingencies, the specific vulnerabilities in a plan that look solid until they don't. Ranger slept, or seemed to, his eyes occasionally slid open, when Cole shifted position, confirmed that nothing requiring action was happening, and closed again. The dog's trust in Cole's vigilance was Cole had always thought one of the more generous things anyone had ever extended to him. At 4 in the morning, Cole got up and built the fire up and made coffee and sat with George Alderton's journal in his lap without opening it, just holding it. The leather was soft and slightly textured under his fingers, worn by handling in a way that told you something about the seriousness with which it had been kept. A man had sat in this cave and written the truth in this book because he believed the truth had weight and permanence even when it was being buried, had believed that weight would eventually bring it back to the surface. Cole thought about what it had taken to believe that. In the fall of 1962, losing your land, losing the fight through every channel available to you, loading your frightened family into whatever they'd had to load them into, driving away from the only place you'd built, and still believing with enough conviction to spend your last days there carefully preserving the evidence that the truth would find its way to someone. He thought about what that kind of faith cost and what it said about the man who had managed it. "I'll do right by it," Cole said to the cabin, to the cave, to no one in particular. His voice was low and quiet in the 4 o'clock silence. Ranger's ear turned toward him. The Cascade County Courthouse was a sandstone building that had been erected in 1923 and had the particular quality of old civic architecture, solid, serious, slightly austere, that suggested its builders had intended it to last. Cole parked the truck in the lot and sat for a moment. He was wearing a suit that Walt had produced from the back of his store without explanation, a dark gray wool that fit Cole well enough to suggest it had been kept for a purpose. Cole had asked no questions. He had put it on. Ranger dropped from the truck and stood beside him, looking at the courthouse with his ears forward. Cole had been uncertain about bringing the dog into the proceedings, had raised it with Lenora, who had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Bring him." A canine service animal accompanying a veteran with documented PTSD is legally present and contextually relevant. Cole had decided not to examine that too closely. They went in. The courtroom was smaller than the ones Cole had seen on television, and more serious feeling wooden benches. High windows letting in flat winter light, a gallery that was perhaps a third full. Walt was in the back row. He had his hat on his knee and his hands folded, and he nodded once when Cole came in a small, complete gesture. Prescott Morrow was already seated at the respondent's table with 2 attorneys whose suits cost more than Cole's truck. He looked composed, settled, the expression of a man who has been in rooms like this before and has generally found them to behave in ways favorable to him. He did not look at Cole when Cole came in. His attorneys looked at Ranger, and one of them leaned to the other and murmured something. Neither said anything aloud. Cole sat down beside Lenora. Ranger went under the table and settled with one paw touching Cole's boot, the same contact point he always chose, the one that transmitted the dog's steadiness directly through the leather and into Cole's foot. An anchor, a reminder of something real. Judge Patricia Hughes entered at 11 exactly. She was 60, direct in her demeanor, with the focused efficiency of a person who has a specific relationship with her own time and intends to honor it. She reviewed the filings for several minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. "Mr. Morrow's motion challenges the validity of Mr. Baxter's ownership on 2 grounds," she said. "Residency standing and historical title conflict. Ms. Vance, you've filed a response with attached exhibits. I've reviewed the exhibits." She paused. "I have quite a few questions." What followed was not the dramatic confrontation Cole had half expected. It was something more thorough and in some ways more devastating. A methodical procedural dismantling of Morrow's position, conducted largely through questions that Judge Hughes asked of both sides, in the patient, precise manner of someone who already knows most of the answers and is creating a record. Lenora presented the documents from the first box. The judge examined them. Morrow's lead attorney argued that documents of such age and uncertain provenance could not be considered reliable. Lenora pointed to the Geological Survey's independent notarization and asked the attorney to explain how a notary stamp from a Billings firm that had been in continuous operation since 1948 constituted uncertain provenance. The attorney moved on. Lenora presented the transfer instrument. The judge looked at the signature lines for a long time. Morrow's attorney argued that handwriting variation in documents 60 years old was not probative of duress, and that the chain of ownership from the 1962 transfer forward was unambiguous and legally sound. Then Lenora set George Alderton's journal on the evidence table. The room changed, not dramatically, not with a gasp from the gallery or a theatrical reaction from Morrow's table. Just a shift in the quality of attention in the room, the way a room shifts when something enters it that everyone present understands is significant. Lenora walked the judge through it entry by entry, not reading passages but summarizing them, with the careful precision of a woman who had spent her career translating human experience into legal language without losing the human part. She quoted two passages directly within the 15-word limit of what was legally advisable, and let the record reflect what George Alderton had written in his own hand about what had been done to his family and by whom and why. Morrow was very still at his table. Cole watched him. Not with satisfaction, that wasn't what he felt. He felt something more complicated, a recognition of the way certain kinds of men move through their lives, in the certainty that the mechanisms they've inherited will continue to function, and the particular quality of their stillness when they begin to understand that the mechanism has failed. Then something happened that Cole had not anticipated. The courtroom door opened. Sheriff Hank Dodd came in. He walked to the front of the room with the deliberate step of a man who has decided something and is in the process of acting on it before he can reconsider. He spoke briefly to the bailiff. Judge Hughes looked up. Dodd identified himself and requested permission to address the court as a voluntary witness. The judge looked at both counsels. Morrow's attorney started to object. Judge Hughes held up a hand. "I'll hear him," she said. The PTSD hit without warning. Cole had been managing it all morning through the mechanism of focus, keeping his attention on the proceedings on Lenora, on the documents, on the specific task in front of him. But the courtroom had been filling with small sounds for 2 hours. The shuffle of papers, the movement of people in the gallery, and then Judge Hughes's gavel came down on the bench, a clean, sharp crack to call order, as Morrow's attorney's objection grew louder. The sound hit Cole somewhere below conscious processing. Not sand this time, not heat. Just the crack itself reverberating, and then the specific closing sensation vision tunneling at the edges, the room going slightly unreal. The sounds of the courtroom becoming layered and wrong in the way that meant the passenger had arrived and was making itself present. His hand went to Ranger under the table. The dog was already moving, already pressing his full weight against Cole's leg, pushing into the contact with the firm, insistent pressure that said, "I am here. You are here. This is real. This is now." Cole's fingers went into the fur. He breathed, once measured, twice. The tunnel closed. The room came back. 2 sentences. That was all it took. 2 sentences and Ranger's weight against his leg and the anchor of the dog's paw on his boot. Cole realized, sitting in that courtroom with his hand in his dog's fur and the proceedings continuing around him, that this was the first time the passenger had come and been managed so quickly that no one in the room had noticed anything at all. Not Lenora beside him, not the judge, not Morrow across the room. He breathed again. From the back of the gallery, Walt Greer, who had noticed, because Walt noticed everything that mattered, gave a single small nod. Cole turned his attention back to Dodd. The sheriff had gone back to the cabin site 2 nights ago. Not because he had been asked to, and not because it was strictly within the protocol of a complaint he had declined to formally record. He had gone because something in the way Cole had looked at him across the desk, not angry, not accusing, just clear-eyed and steady in the manner of a man making a direct assessment, had stayed with Dodd in the days following and refused to settle. He had found three things. The first was additional boot print evidence that the snowfall had partially preserved and then exposed a clear impression than Cole's photographs had captured, showing a specific tread pattern that Dodd, in 30 years of working this county, recognized. It belonged to a line of work boots sold exclusively through the supply company that serviced Morrow's construction operations. The second was a small piece of equipment, a radio frequency device designed to disrupt generator signals partially buried in the snow at the tree line. Not Cole's, not random. The kind of thing that required both resources and specific knowledge of what generator model was being targeted. The third thing was a filing at the county recorder's office that Dodd had pulled after reviewing the equipment. A document submitted 6 weeks before Cole's purchase, before Cole had any knowledge of the cave house's existence, in which Morrow's holding company had filed a preemptive claim of historical interest in the cave house parcel. Filed quietly in the particular bureaucratic language designed to exist in the record, without drawing attention to be activated if needed. Morrow had known about the mineral rights, had known about the documents, or at least had known there was a risk that something was buried on that property that could undo 60 years of inherited fraud, and he had been positioning himself to neutralize it. When Dodd finished his statement, the courtroom was very quiet. Morrow's lead attorney conferred with his colleague in urgent whispers. Then he requested a continuance. Judge Hughes denied it. Mr. Morrow's motion challenging Mr. Baxter's title is denied, she said in the flat final tone of a judge who has completed her analysis and is reporting its results. The evidence presented today establishes not only the validity of Mr. Baxter's ownership, but raises substantial questions regarding the foundational title claim through which Mr. Morrow asserts historical interest. She looked at the documents on her bench. I am referring this matter to the county attorney for investigation of the 1962 transfer and all subsequent title instruments deriving from it. I am also referring Sheriff Dodd's evidence to the same office for review of potential criminal conduct. She set down her pen. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Cole sat still. Ranger pressed harder against his leg for a moment, the dog feeling something in Cole's stillness that required acknowledgement, and then relaxed, settling into the loose posture of an animal that has been on alert for a long time and has received the signal that the alert is over. Across the room, Prescott Morrow stood. His attorneys were gathering their papers with the focused efficiency of people managing a situation. Morrow himself stood without moving for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and Cole watched something cross the man's face, not defeat exactly, but the specific recalibration of a man who has operated within a certain set of assumptions for his entire life and is in the process of understanding that those assumptions were built on something that has now been removed. He did not look at Cole. He walked out. Cole looked at the evidence table, at George Alderton's journal, which would now enter the official record of Cascade County and stay there. Lenora put her hand briefly on Cole's forearm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Dodd found Cole in the parking lot. The sheriff came across the snow with his hat in his hand, which Cole noted as a gesture a man who removes his hat is making himself smaller on purpose. Dodd stopped a few feet away. He looked at Ranger, who was sitting beside Cole and watching Dodd with neutral attention. Not the flat-eared Morrow growl, not the affectionate ease he showed Walt. Something in between, measured, waiting. I should have taken the report, Dodd said, when you came in. Cole looked at him. I saw what I expected to see, Dodd continued. A man living rough complaining about a broken window. I didn't look past that. He held Cole's gaze. That was wrong, and I'm sorry for it. Cole was quiet for a moment. He thought about the right thing to say and rejected several versions of it before arriving at the one that was actually true. You came back, Cole said. That counts. Dodd put his hat back on. He looked at the courthouse behind Cole. This county has a 60-year debt to a family that got pushed off their land. That's not going to be easy to settle. No, Cole said. It's not. Dodd nodded once. He turned and walked to his patrol car. Cole watched him go. Ranger watched until the car was out of the parking lot, then looked up at Cole. The amber eyes carried their usual quality, steady present, waiting for the next thing to begin. Walt was the last one out of the courthouse. He came across the parking lot in no hurry, his hat back on hands and his jacket pockets against the cold. He stopped beside Cole and looked at the truck for a moment. Then he said, "There's something I need to tell you." Cole waited. Walt was quiet for a moment in the way of a man organizing something he has been carrying for a long time. "My father knew George Alderton well," he said, "better than I told you before." He looked at the courthouse, then at Cole. "My father was the one George called the night before the Aldertons left, called to say goodbye, to tell him where the documents were buried in case my father ever found someone to give the information to." He paused. "My father kept that to himself for 30 years. He told me when he was dying, said he'd spent those 30 years trying to find someone honest enough and capable enough to do something with it, and he never had." Cole looked at him. "I've had that bulletin board notice written for 2 years, Walt said. Waiting, changing the date on it every month or so, keeping it current. He paused, again choosing the word, "a feeling about you the morning you came in. The D. The way you counted out the coin." Something moved across his expression. "George Alderton used to say that a good dog and an honest man will always find what needs finding." His exact words. I heard them from my father so many times I could say them in my sleep. The parking lot was very quiet. Cold air, white sky, the sound of the county road a half-mile away. Cole looked at the old man who had placed a $20 notice on a board and waited for the right person to walk through his door the way his father had waited before him and George Alderton had waited before that. 3 generations of waiting for a truth that refused to die. He didn't have words adequate to that. He wasn't sure words were what was needed. He put his hand out. Walt took it, a firm, brief grip, the kind that carries more in its pressure than a conversation could in an hour. Ranger pressed his nose briefly against Walt's hand. Walt looked down at the palm, and his expression shifted into something that had the shape of a 60-year debt being partially paid. The foundation took 8 months to build. Cole used the legal settlement, a figure negotiated between the county, Attorney Morrow's people, and Lenora Vance that Cole declined to speak publicly about, but that Lenora described privately as more than adequate and less than complete justice, which is what settlements generally are, to purchase a 12-acre parcel adjacent to his own land on the north side. He called it Ranger's Ridge. The design was simple because Cole had designed it himself with functionality as the primary requirement. 8 individual cabins, each with a small fenced yard, a common building with a kitchen, a sitting room, a wood stove, a training field in the cleared area between the tree line and the lake, a small medical station staffed 3 days a week by a physician's assistant from Harlow who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan and understood the particular healthcare needs of the population the shelter served. The specific design feature that generated the most interest when word spread through the network of veteran services organizations in the region, every cabin was built for a man and a dog, not man-friendly with a tolerance policy, built for both. Wide doorways, specific kennel spaces, a veterinary supply cabinet in the common building, a fenced running area large enough for working breed dogs to actually work. Veterans came. Not in a flood, not at first. But steadily, the way word spreads through communities built on trust and shared experience. Men who had fallen through the gaps between military service and civilian life, some of them carrying visible damage and some carrying the invisible kind, arriving at the end of the county road in trucks and old cars and occasionally on foot with dogs of various breeds and sizes and states of training. Some of the Ds needed as much rehabilitation as their owners. Cole understood this. He had resources now to address it. Walt drove out the first Friday of every month and sat on the step of the common building and drank coffee with whoever was around. He had, at Cole's request, helped interview the first three residents, his particular gift for reading men in a single conversation, proving useful in ways that no formal screening process could replicate. Dodd became an unofficial liaison, not a formal arrangement, just a man who stopped by, who kept an eye on the access road, who had, over the months following the hearing, developed a relationship with Cole built on the specific foundation of a wrong acknowledged and a debt being actively worked down. The cave house itself, Cole did not change. He repaired the roof properly, replaced the broken window, sourced period-appropriate lumber for the floor section that had rotted near the fireplace. He put a good door on. He winterized the structure in the ways that mattered and left alone the things that didn't need changing. The first box sat in Lenora's office, locked in her evidence safe, pending the formal resolution of the Morrow title investigation. The journal had been formally entered into the Cascade County Historical Record, photographed for preservation, and was in the process of being referenced by a legal historian at the University of Montana, who was documenting a pattern of rural land fraud in the region during the post-war decades. George Alderton's name was in the official record now. His words were in the official record. The truth he had buried and trusted to time and an honest man's dog had surfaced and taken up the permanent institutional weight of documented history. Cole thought about him sometimes. In the morning, standing on the step of the cave house with coffee looking at the lake, he thought about what it had cost to write those entries and seal them in the wall and walk away. He thought about the quality of faith required to do that. Not religious faith, not the kind that relies on the supernatural, but the more difficult kind. The faith that says, I will do the right thing now in this moment, and trust that rightness has consequences that outlast the moment. He thought he understood that better than he ever had. The evening of the foundation's official opening, after the small ceremony, and the food Walt had organized, and the awkward, genuine gratitude of the three men who were already in residence, Cole walked with Ranger around the lake perimeter. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, the sky layered in orange and deep rose and the particular cold blue that comes in over Montana winter evenings like a slow tide. The lake reflected it imperfectly, broken by wind into shifting pieces of color. The pines along the far shore were going dark, their shapes exact against the luminous sky. Cole walked without hurrying. Ranger moved beside him, occasionally drifting ahead to read the ground, then returning to Cole's side in the easy, rhythmic pattern of a god on familiar territory, with no immediate task except presence. At the north end of the lake, near where the water came closest to the rocky hillside below the cave house, Ranger stopped. He had his nose down at the base of a flat-faced boulder that sat half buried in snow at the water's edge. He was moving with the careful, specific attention that Cole had learned to distinguish from idle investigation, the quality of purpose, the focused stillness. Cole crouched beside him. The boulder's base met the ground in a gap that the seasons had opened and opened again over decades. Ranger's nose was working into that gap. Cole reached in with his hand. His fingers touched something that was not rock and not soil. He worked it out carefully. A small canvas pouch, more decomposed than the oilcloth in the boxes, but structurally intact. The canvas had been treated with something wax or oil and that had slowed the years. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, small, slightly water damaged at one corner, but clear. A man, a woman, 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, the girl the youngest, standing in front of the cave house. Summer from the light and the clothes, smiling. The man had one hand on the shoulder of the older boy and the other around his wife's waist. The woman was laughing at something outside the frame. The children had the expressions that children have in photographs taken on ordinary good days, slightly impatient, fully alive, present in the moment without knowing it would be kept. On the back, in the same careful hand, from the journal, Clearwater, August 1961. Our best summer. If you find this, know we were happy here. Know this was a good place. G.A. Cole sat on his heels in the snow at the edge of the lake and held the photograph in both hands and looked at it for a long time. The sky was going darker, the colors deepening and thinning at their edges. The lake made small sounds against the ice at the shore. Somewhere in the trees behind the foundation buildings, a door opened and closed, and the sound of voices came briefly across the water and then was absorbed by the distance. Cole looked at George Alderton's face, the hand on his son's shoulder, the ease of a man on his own land in his best summer, not knowing yet what the next year would take from him, fully present in the ordinary goodness of a Tuesday in August. He tucked the photograph carefully into his breast pocket, against his chest. Ranger sat beside him and leaned not the full weight grounding press of the difficult moments, but the easy companionable lean of a dog in a good place with his person at the end of a good day. Cole put his hand on the dog's back and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The last light went off the ridge. Behind them, the cave house stood at the base of the hillside with its windows casting warm yellow light across the snow. And beyond it, the foundation cabins were lit and occupied, and from the common building came the sound of men talking in the specific register of people who have found, after a long time of being without it, a place that receives them. Cole looked at all of it. He thought about $20, about a coal parking lot in the rain, about an index card on a bulletin board, and an old man who had been waiting for the right person. He thought about a box buried under cave floor and a journal sealed in a cavity in the rock, and a man who had done both those things in full faith that the truth would find its way to someone worthy of carrying it. He thought about Ranger, the dog who had known from the first night, who had sat in the dark with his ears pointed at the cave and waited with the complete, unshakable patience of an animal that understands that finding what needs to be found is not a matter of luck or timing, but of attention, of paying attention completely and not stopping when the human fails to follow. The wind came off the water cold and clean, carrying pine-needles and the mineral smell of deep stone. Cole Baxter was 38 years old. He had served his country and come home broken in ways that had taken years to understand and more years to begin to manage. He had lost almost everything that a man can lose without losing himself. He had spent 8 months in a truck in Montana with $3 in a dog and no clear sense of what came next. He was still here. The passenger was still there too. He understood it would always be. But it had lost the dominion it once had displaced by something that had been growing steadily in the months since the cave and the journal and the courtroom and the building behind him full of light and men in togs. He had a name for it now, not hope, something past hope. Purpose, the particular weight of a life that has found the thing it is for and is in the process of being it. Ranger shook himself once and then looked up at Cole. Ready. Cole stood. He looked at the photograph-shaped weight against his chest, at the cave house and the foundation cabins and the lit windows reflecting yellow on the snow. Ranger didn't lead him to gold. He led him back to himself. Ranger barked once, sharp and certain, the sound carrying clean across the water and into the dark of the pines and up toward the cold stars beginning to appear above the western ridge. Once was enough. It always had been.